Greetings everyone to another The History Of. We let you decide the topic on this one in the community tab a little while ago. Most of the votes went to the Russian VSR 93 camouflage pattern. This camouflage, a decently significant one, has been a go-to pattern used by almost every branch of the Russian armed forces and various other federal units since the fall of the Soviet Union. We'll be going over this pattern's interesting history, diverse and curious iterations, and variants as well. So let's take a closer look. To say Russia has had a few camouflage patterns during its history is a bit of an understatement. With it introducing a few patterns in the late 1930s and early 40s, its armed forces, federal, and other governmental agencies have utilized dozens of patterns with numerous other variations. With that in mind, it's important that we mention that finding information on certain ones can be a bit harder than others, as official documentation from the Soviet Union wasn't often released to the public, meaning finding official sources on many items is even harder now. That being said, VSR 93 is a bit of a logistical oddity, as it began its life during the time of the Soviet Union, but didn't really see full usage until the formation of the Russian Federation. So, one could consider it one of the Soviet Union's final camouflage patterns, or Russia's first. Throughout its life, it would see numerous variations and versions, some intentional and others not so much. Okay, so where do we begin? Well, 2007 actually. It was during this year an airborne championship was held, which saw a handful of units competing against one another in various competitions. One team was from the 45th VDV, also known as the 45th Spetsnaz Airborne Brigade, which took first place in recon platoon-based challenges. However, the win wasn't what caught many people's eyes, but rather the camouflage many of the members wore during the challenges. Known simply as recon camouflage or the recon uniform, this rarely seen pattern was, and still sort of is, used almost exclusively by special reconnaissance and engineer units. It was at this point comparisons were made to VSR 93, as the orientation and sizes of the shapes were very similar. Although the pattern was rarely seen at that point, it had also been a thing for about 20 years, as it was used by select Soviet forces during the later half of the 1980s. Referred to by various names such as the Recon pattern, Woodland Recon, Barvika, and VSR drawing variant, it was first seen on heavier weight early 80s uniforms such as the OBR-88, also known as the Afghanka, and although not entirely confirmed, it has been claimed to have been used by either reconnaissance and scout forces or certain units operating in the steppe regions of Eastern and Central Asia. One thing that is a bit more known, however, was that it proved to be something of a starting point for the origin of VSR. If you take the two patterns and put them side by side, you will notice that the two share a number of similarities. The main differences being the number of colors, as well as the fact that the recon shapes sort of bleed into one another. It has a more basic, almost painted look, which has resulted in a few referring to it as the VSR drawing pattern, as if it was the original version pulled right off a concept illustration. This pattern came during a time, the early to mid-80s, when the Soviet military was in something of a period of experimentation and development as far as uniforms and gear goes. A part of this period of experimentation came the somewhat mysterious camouflage development project simply known as Bhutan. Though not a lot of information is known about it, many patterns seem to have stemmed from this project, such as the Recon, as well as the TTSKO pattern, which saw large-scale distribution around 1985. This pattern, along with many others from this time, were seen as a step in breaking away from older ideas, designs, and cuts, and was the start of a larger goal of updating, modernizing, and perhaps most importantly, giving a more professional and uniform appearance throughout the armed forces. Things started to really pick up in 1988 when a rather large-scale and somewhat all-encompassing update began by the Ministry of Defense. Rather than adjust one thing here or there as it had been done decades prior, its goal was to almost completely change various types of uniforms from dress and parade to field all at once. The department reached out to designer Vyacheslav Zaitsev for help, but he was already tasked with designing new Soviet police uniforms. So, the Scientific and Technical Committee of the Central Clothing Department of the Ministry of Defense got to work. A part of this overhaul? Standardizing the camouflage of the military to one pattern, VSR. First images of the VSR camouflage began being seen in publications around 1990. with one of the first color sightings seen on the cover of the magazine Soviet Warrior in 1991. It showcased the pattern on an M88 jacket as well as an M38 field hat, with a description on the back which mentioned how the pattern was planned on being the successor to the current one, but with factories having outdated machines and textiles, a lack of material such as threads and dyes, the likelihood of this happening was low. This was because at the time the Soviet Union was on its last legs for a number of reasons. A term coined by Mikhail Gorbachev, the era of stagnation began with Leonid Brezhnev in 1964 to roughly 1985 when Gorbachev took power. This time period saw little innovation and advancement in many aspects of social, political, and economic policies. This, mixed with heavy military spending, caused the Soviet economy to stall. When Gorbachev took power in 1985, he attempted to revitalize the country through a series of reforms and new policies. One of these was to cut military spending. This led to the new uniform program getting caught in a sort of state of limbo. On December 26, 1991, the USSR officially dissolved, effectively causing the 15 countries that made up the Union to become independent nations. As President Boris Yeltsin transitioned Russia into a federation, he realized the armed forces were in something of a state of disarray. It needed to move away from its Soviet image and transition to a more professional and modern-looking one. Throughout much of the Soviet Union's history, it had held a stance that any threat or attack on a Soviet bloc country was an attack on them all. This led to such policies as the Brezhnev Doctrine. Because of this, military or security forces would sometimes directly intervene, resulting in many viewing them in a poor light. Coupled with various newly independent nations that potentially harbored ill will towards Russia, the need to distinguish the newly restructured Voorozheny Sily Rusi, or Armed Forces of Russia, with a new image was needed, as many of these countries were equipped with the same gear, uniforms, and camouflage as the Soviet armed forces. And so because of this, Russia turned to VSR, adopting it in March of 1993 as the standard camouflage uniform. Although there had been sporadic sightings of it used by airborne and other select special forces units as early as 1991, the camouflage had more or less reached the bulk of Russian armed forces by the end of 1994. Okay, so now we must ask the question, what does VSR actually mean? Well, you may have just caught it, but it is the English abbreviation for Voorozheny Sily Rusi, which translates to Armed Forces of Russia, with the 93 often seen at the end being the year of its supposed adoption. However, this name and designation isn't exactly correct. No, in fact, this name was given to it mainly by collectors as a way of identifying it, as the official name remains somewhat elusive. This pattern goes by many other names, some of which are vertical, after the orientation of its shapes, barvika, after the alleged name for the prototype versions. This, however, is usually associated with the early 1990s versions of VSR. The Schofield pattern, which was the name of the author Cary Schofield, who, in 1991, published the book Inside the Soviet Military, which included one of the earliest photos of the VSR being used. Watermelon, because the pattern itself somewhat resembles the shapes seen on the outside of a watermelon. Dubak, meaning oak or little oak, after the pattern appearing similar to the bark of an oak tree. And finally, Bhutan, after Project Bhutan. However, that name is something of a blanket term, as it is used for other patterns which came out of the project, such as TTSKO. Alright, let's actually talk about the pattern's composition. Boiled down to the basics, VSR is a vertical-oriented pattern made up of 3 different colored shapes, most of the time. Initially, 2 different versions were seen, a green-based or woodland version, and a brown-based or arid mountainous version. However, this is where things get a little bit peculiar. If you were to search VSR camouflage online, your reaction would probably be something along these lines.
Wow, look at all the colors, man!
To say VSR has had a few versions doesn't do it justice. Over the years, there have been numerous variants spotted and speculated about. This has caused people to fall into one of 3 categories in trying to understand why. The first is that each version is intentional, with them being printed for different terrains or specific units. The second is that aside from the initial 2 versions, all the other variations were just a matter of different factory methods of printing and creation. Variations caused by shifting dyes, fabrics, textiles, Soviet and post-Soviet equipment, and so on over the years resulted in numerous color and pattern differences. Then finally, the third is almost something in the middle, as collectors and others have pointed out that some variants are greatly different than others. and suggests that more official versions were made after 1993, seeing offshoots of those in the following years because of poor quality control in the factories producing them. However, the variants discussion does not include the other, more vibrant versions of VSR adopted by separate security, response, and governmental forces later on in the decade. Some of those were an almost mustard-colored, that being orange and brown dominant version, sometimes referred to as yolka or fir tree, was seen being worn in the mid-1990s by the Federal Penitentiary Service, as well as other units from the Ministry of Justice and Ministry of Internal Affairs. Certain members of Oman, a special force of the Russian police, which falls under the Ministry of Internal Affairs, was seen using a blue dominant VSR pattern while operating in Chechnya. And if one brightly colored version wasn't enough, another one, which was fielded by the Ministry of Emergency Situations, was seen towards the end of the decade, though the scope of its usage isn't fully known. This version saw a more stark orange background with fuller blacks and dark grays. Anyway, though, the original VSR continued to be used by the armed forces throughout the 1990s until the Flora pattern was unveiled in 1998 and took its place as the primary camouflage pattern. As for the reason why it was replaced, well, the vertical orientation mainly. Though it did work in certain environments in certain ways, such as lying in a prone position, it didn't blend in very well overall. But another supposed reason that may have contributed was it wasn't very appealing to viewers watching parades that included troops wearing it. Either way, the pattern continued to be used sporadically alongside Flora for a few years after. During its time, the pattern, or versions of it, were exported or made by other countries such as Azerbaijan, Belarus, Tajikistan, Ukraine, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. And with that, we've come to the end of another rather involving episode. Remember, VSR became something of a symbol of the Russian Federation's military. Its history is long and somewhat confusing. As mentioned, a lot of information relating to Russia and Soviet gear, specifically camouflage, is a bit hard to come by, with a lot of its aspects still up for debate. We want to take a moment to thank Discord user Nyan Commissar, who helped provide this video with a variety of information, material, as well as a bit of translation services. Hopefully this video was educational and or entertaining, and be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell to be notified about future videos, as we're planning quite a few in the near future. Either way, be sure to check back soon for more of the history of, right here on Uniform History.